Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, my darlings. Today I bring you a continuation of a series I started many, many months ago by JxB Paperboy. This one is the third in the series, Patients in Cell 14. It was dark and gloomy in the mental ward. But of course it was. It was indeed nighttime. And during this time, most of the guards of the mental ward 32 sat around in the break room playing cards. Down the dark hall, the occasional guard can be found dozing off mid-shift or staring at something outside a window. But if one is listening closely, a soft scratching can be heard, finding its way to those who listen to the night. This noise originated from cell 14, across from the small subject 13 cell. But unlike 13, subject 14 had a name. Sean Wing was but a young boy when his back began forming 2 small bumps. He underwent 4 surgeries in 3 years to remove them. However, both times the surgeon and his assistant would be launched to the walls, snapping several bones. When security would enter the room to respond, and the child would be floating in the middle of the room, back painted in his own blood from the 2 bumps just under his shoulder blades. Of course, his parents eventually caught on to something strange happening with their child, and the rest speaks for itself. The night guard Shade was on duty, doing his dutiful rounds through cell block 3 to the soft scratching from cell 14. Of course, around a certain time of night, Shade approached the cell and shined his light in. Dee peeked over his shoulder and squinted. The boy's quiet again. Egio stepped around both Dee and Shade, pulling on Dee's ear and peering into the cell himself. Dee, be kind to subject 14, and stop calling him a boy. He clearly is not of that age, and has not been for some time now. Shade unlocked the door of the cell and stepped inside, allowing the door to swing closed behind him. The cell was littered in dry blood, and the walls painted in strokes of parallel red stains. From the corner the scratching continued, with soft grunting emanating from the same source. Shade pointed his light over to the corner. The light revealed the frame of a skinny man, not thin to the bone, but thin enough to see the bone, rubbing new stains on the wall of his cell. His face huffed in discomfort, but his eyes were glazed in ecstasy. The bumps on his back were covered in blood, and scars from the bumps blood dripped to the floor, gathering in a puddle inches from a pair of flat feet, surrounded by shredded bandages. Ah, gross! He's doing the masochistic thing again. Dee lifted himself into the air, floating in front of the cell's occupant. You know, with that expression on your face, it's hard to tell if you're actually enjoying it or not. Dee rose into the air laughing, as Sean's eyes locked onto the apparition hungrily. He leaned forward off the wall, his arms hanging at his side, and his huffing breath transitioning to a low chuckling. His shoulders shook as he hunched over, sticking his shoulder bumps into the air. By the cell door, Shade and Egio watched as arms clawed their way out of the bumps. Unbeknownst to him, Dee kept laughing as the arms crawled out of Sean's back and clawed through the air to Dee's ankle. Before he could notice, Dee was on the ground, hands clawing at his body, and Sean flashing his teeth in a cruel smile over him. Dee screamed and screamed, while Shade and Egio looked on, frozen in place. Sean giggled as his hands groped Dee, reminiscent of a child ripping the skin off a squirrel. His head dipped from side to side. As his giggles grew into a small cackle, Egio stepped forward. Before he felt a tug on his own ankle, more hands had crawled out of Sean's humps, and more were coming. It was at this point that Shade stepped back, pressed his backside against the door. The door's key slid in with a thunk, and Shade swung open the door and fell out of the cell, kicking the door closed as soon as he hit the floor. The slam echoed through the halls, but the other guards continued their routines, playing oblivious to the goings-on of the ward. The other cells bustled with activity, and little Subject 13 peeked over her dirty knees at the cell across from hers. The hands coming out of Sean's back had Egio and Di by the throat. Laughter emanated from the masochist as his arms flung the two spirits around like rag dolls. Shade's heart pounded as he watched the sadist play with his two new toys. He got to his feet and pulled out his baton. His feet took a step back towards the cell, but the rest of his body stopped him. Egio and Di groaned in pain as they struggled out of their captor's grasp, screaming for the night guard's help. In cell 13, Subject 13 silently stood up, staring at the events happening in front of her. A voice whispered for her to reach out, and her hand followed suit. Wendell burst out of nothing in front of her, grabbing her wrist and rushing into her face. "Dearie, dearie, what are we doing here?" Her head twitched in a twisted grin as 13 flinched. "Helping an oppressor is not something someone like you would do." Wendell's shredded cheek whipped with her jawline as she turned her head to Subject 14 and back to 13. In a throaty yet sputtered laugh, Wendell let go of 13's wrist. "Is this about that other boy? The one with the humps?" 13 brought her shoulders in and dropped her arm. "Yes," she whispered softly. Behind her, two towering forms of men flickered into existence. Their bodies shivered as other spirits came out with them. A girl with a braid and an exit wound in her forehead floated up to Wendell. She put her hand on Wendell's ear and whispered something to her. Wendell's head and expression grew from annoyance to delight as the other ghost told her a dirty little secret. "Well, dearest 13, according to what poor little Mary has told me," she pointed a ghastly finger to the boy with arms coming out of his back, "that you like that boy, 13. Is this true?" 13 flicked a glance at the braided ghost and a transparent drop of blood trickled out of her wound. Then she fixed a tired stare at Wendell before quietly replying, "Yes." Wendell leaned on air, putting her legs up behind her and placing her untouched cheek on a hand. "Oh, and what do you see in him? Is it looks? Like there's much of that going around. Or is it that you see a tortured soul that you can fix, so in turn he could love and fix a horrid little broken thing like you?" 13 stared at the floor while Wendell continued her rant, floating around her while she went on and on until, "You realize that we are the only ones who can decide what's best, right, Leela?" Leela. That was her name. She knew that name. Oh, so long ago. And this lit something in her. Her teeth became gritted as her stare furrowed into a glare. Her hands clenched into fists as her arms shook and glared at Wendell. "Shut up." Wendell stopped floating, touching her feet to the ground and staring at her. "What was that, child?" 13 glared at her. eyes a pale hazel. I said shut up. Wendell stepped towards 13, only to stop. Her throat began to retch, as if to indicate choking, and her neck was squeezed down to the spinal cord. Wendell's eyes bulged as she held onto her neck and stared helplessly at the spirits around 13. The other ghosts shifted restlessly, switching glances between their host and their leader. Without turning her head, Subject 13 whispered, "Free them." The ghosts sprung into action, leaping through the bars, rushing past Shade into cell 14, grabbing the two shadows of the prison guard. 12 ghostly figures grabbed the entangling arms of Sean and pulled, the arms losing their grip on the wraiths. Upon their release, Dee and Egio flew out of the cell, back into Shade. Shade watched as the spirits tangled with the sadist as, one by one, they fled back to the safety of cell 13. He turned around as the girl, Leela, sat down and hugged her knees. The spirits around her gathered around a crumpled figure, Wendell. The guard of cell block 13 took a tentative step forward before turning around to cell 14 with narrowed eyes. Subject 14 was silent, and the arms coming out of his back were retracting into the humps. 14 slumped to the ground, breathing heavily, his thin frame shuddering with the effort. Shade grabbed one of the bars and looked down at him, shining his light through the bars. "Well, what do you have to say for yourself, Sean?" he asked. The subject looked up at the light unflinchingly. Through cracked lips and a raspy voice he spoke. "Sorry. If you hadn't entered, it would have been better for the three of us." Sean looked across the hall into the opposite cell. Shade raised a brow and followed Sean's trance before putting his light away. With a sigh, Shade turned face. "No breakfast come morning." He walked towards the end of the hall, Dee and Egio in tow. They were silent, but the other cells were rustling with disturbed subjects. And as Shade made his final round for the night, most would have heard him mutter, "I think he meant for the two of us." So quoth this raven. Oh, it's nice to have another chapter in this story. I wonder where it would go. I have to tell you that Sean does remind me a little bit of Lucy in Elfenlied, which also consequently inspired 11 in Stranger Things. Just the arms that are able to lift him and do all sorts of things and are often invisible. I really like that. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me this lovely Tuesday, my darlings. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, and Charlotte Emerson. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.